In the spring and summer of 2014, the Kremlin media made all efforts to demonize the Ukrainian military in every possible way, in order to provide informational support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This allowed them to put a spin on the numerous war crimes committed by Russian terrorists as an alleged retaliation, and thereby justified the excessive brutality of the militants. By the autumn, after the liberation of two-thirds of the Donbas territories, it became obvious that there was no genocide of the Russian-speaking population. Residents of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Mariupol returned to a peaceful life, and the period of the DPR occupation was forgotten as a nightmare. In this context, the militia gangs completely lost their heroic image of freedom fighters. In the spring of 2015, after the bloody Battle of Debaltseve, the plans for a westward expansion of Novorossiya vanished without a trace. Given the fact that the Minsk agreements were signed and the hostilities transitioned into a state of trench warfare, the Russian media started talking about peace. About peace on the terms of the Kremlin. You're watching the 89th episode of the History of the War series. In the spring of 2014, the Russian Federation annexed Crimea and in the following summer invaded the east of Ukraine. As a result of a number of battles, this offensive was successfully halted, but the war was far from over. Espionage and diplomacy, economics, propaganda and armed combat. These are all the elements of hybrid warfare, which we're trying to figure out. At the end of March 2016, despite the general tension in the anti-terrorist operation zone, Avdiivka became the main focus of media attention. The struggle for control over the industrial zone in the eastern part of the city continued literally around the clock. Having gained a foothold in this area, Ukrainian troops secured the Donetsk-Horlivka highway within an effective range. It's worth noting that this highway was of great importance for the terrorists, especially when it came down to military matters, as it allowed for rapid redeployment of troops along the front line. While fighting for such an important object, the militants didn't hesitate to fire heavy weapons, including cannon artillery. Meanwhile, the conflict flared up along the entire front line in the Donetsk sector. Over the period of March 30th to 31st, more than 100 large-caliber shells and about 400 mortar shells were fired at Ukrainian positions. As a result of one of these attacks, a soldier of the 57th Brigade, Senior Sergeant Dmitro Hodchenko, was killed in the village of Zaitsevo. 6 more Ukrainian soldiers were injured during this period. Losses among the militants amounted to 5 killed and 3 wounded soldiers. In addition to that, a T-72 tank was totally put out of commission as a result of careless firing. On April 1st, Zaitsevo and Avdiivka still remained the main hotspots in the eastern part of Ukraine. In addition, there was combat near the Donetsk airport in Mariinka. Launches of 2 anti-tank missiles were recorded near the town of Novotroitske. A total of 65 attacks were registered, during which 4 Ukrainian soldiers were severely wounded. On the same day, a train from Russia transporting military hardware, spare parts and 120 tons of various fuels arrived at the Hartzisk station. 15 tanks and 7 trucks with ammunition arrived in Luhansk, and 240 more tons of fuels and lubricants were delivered to the Krasnodon station. It's worth noting that in the spring of 2016, the Russian propaganda media began filming a series of documentaries about the Russian-Ukrainian war. Using standard propaganda methodology, the producers covered activities of local militants while carefully ignoring the work of the Russian military machine. To put it simply, these films depicted real residents of the east of Ukraine. Each of them had a fascinating story and a carefully developed character. While complaining about the circumstances that led to the war, they talked about their participation in the hostilities. However, the newly minted movie stars remained conspicuously silent on the matter of Russian officers commanding their units and sources of weapons mysteriously appearing in the hands of fabricated republics. On April 2nd, the tension decreased slightly and the number of attacks plummeted. However, in Avdiivka and Zaitsevo, the militants still fired mortars on several occasions. To hide from the international observers, the attacks were predominantly launched after sunset. The attacks were mostly harassing, and thankfully, there were no casualties. On the same day, SBU officers detained a military serviceman who was recruited by Russian intelligence services. As the commander of a reconnaissance unit, the agent tried to recruit his subordinates and also transmitted information to the militants about the locations where missions were carried out by reconnaissance units of the Ukrainian army. On April 3rd, a total of 16 instances of shelling were registered in the Donetsk sector. 6 of them took place in Avdiivka. Given the dynamics of recent days, the fact that only 30 mortar shells landed on Ukrainian positions can be rightfully considered a decrease in hostilities. However, there's an explanation for everything. During active attacks, the militants exhausted their offensive potential and were extremely busy accumulating resources. Thus, on April 3rd, 4 tankers, 3 trucks carrying ammunition, and 2 UAZ vehicles arrived to the town of Amrosiivka from the Russian Federation. A train transporting 320 tons of diesel fuel arrived at the Ilovaisk station. Despite all sorts of information tricks, as well as a complete denial on the part of official authorities, the fact of Russian participation in the war was constantly and clearly evidenced by the increasing amounts of direct and indirect hits. After all, it was precisely due to the publication of a large amount of such evidence that the commanders of the so-called Novorossiya army received an order to reduce the proportion of Russian military personnel fighting on the front line to 20% of the total force. In simple words, since April 2016, the Kremlin started demanding that only 1 in 5 fighters in the Donbass trenches could boast about having Russian military papers. However, this principle was frequently ignored due to the shortage of personnel in the units. Mobilization of the local population was of no help in this context. On April 3rd, 18 railway tankers transported fuels and lubricants and 8 trucks carrying ammunition arrived at the Krasnodon station. The very next day, 2 tankers carrying diesel fuel with a total capacity of 120 tons were set on fire by local guerrillas. On April 4th, explosives were discovered under a concrete support bearing of the railway bridge in the Bakhmut county of the Donetsk Oblast. Railway traffic was temporarily suspended until the bombs were successfully defused. The situation along the demarcation line heated up again. Having received reinforcements and resources, the militants increased their activity. There were 7 attacks in the Luhansk sector. A mortar was shooting near Novozvanivka, killing 1 Ukrainian soldier and wounding 3 others. In Zaitsevo, Novhorodsk and Avdiivka, hostilities continued around the clock due to the extremely small distance between the opposing forces. The militants never abandoned their attempts to expand the controlled territory, did not withdraw their heavy weaponry and continued heavy shelling. In an attempt to shore up their position, the occupiers set up a new platoon strongpoint in Zaitsevo, near school number 15. In total, 39 attacks were launched that day in the Donetsk sector. Near Hranitne, the ATO forces repelled an advance by an enemy reconnaissance group, which crossed the Kalmius River and attacked Ukrainian positions. In Talakivka and Shirokino, militants used mortars. In Mariinka, snipers made use of cover offered by built-up areas for their operations. During the day, these battles claimed the lives of 3 Russian soldiers and left another 5 injured. Losses of the Ukrainian troops amounted to 2 dead and 10 wounded. On April 5th, Avdiivka once more became the epicenter of hostilities. Fighting here continued throughout the whole day. During one of the mortar attacks, some shells launched by the militants fell on a residential area. A private house was damaged and household animals were killed. In Piski, a civilian was blown up by an unknown explosive device. A series of mortar attacks was also launched in Shirokino and Krasnohorivka. A number of minor provocations took place in other sectors of the front line as well. 2 Ukrainian soldiers died and 4 more were injured as a result of the fighting. On the same day, a saboteur was caught red-handed by SBU officers. He was planning to blow up a railway near the Izum station. To manufacture his bomb, the saboteur used a large-caliber artillery shell and 2 kilograms of plastic explosives. Given the schematics of the explosive device, there is reason to believe that the attacker was also involved in an attempt to blow up the bridge near Bakhmut, which occurred a day earlier. On April 6th, the situation in the main hotspots of the ATO zone remained tense, though stable. The militants, just as before that, continued their powerful mortar attacks and used counter-artillery not as frequently. During the day, more than 100 shells were launched at Ukrainian positions in the Donetsk sector. There were also attacks on the Svitlodarsk Arc and in the towns of Mariinka, Krasnohorivka and Shirokina. In virtually all cases, the Ukrainian army responded to the situation rapidly and appropriately and put their best efforts forward to suppress the enemy firing positions. As a result of these actions, during the day 5 militants died and another 9 were seriously injured. Meanwhile, the Kremlin continued supplying its occupation forces with fuel and ammunition. On April 6th, 160 tons of diesel fuel and 3 rail cars carrying shells were delivered to Avdiivka, while 500 tons of diesel fuel and 540 tons of gasoline arrived to Krasnodon. A train carrying 260 tons of diesel fuel and 400 tons of gasoline arrived to Rovenki. Some of this fuel was soon stolen and later sold through a network of gas stations affiliated with militant leaders Zakharchenko and Khodakovsky. It's noteworthy that while reporting to the Kremlin, these commanders were actively accusing each other of embezzlement. But here it's important to keep in mind that regardless of the contractor's name, such transactions are impossible without the assistance from representatives of the Russian Federation. To put it simply, high-ranking Russian officers were literally stealing resources from their own country and, in fact, were helping the Ukrainian army. On April 7th, 54 attacks took place in the Donetsk Oblast, and every fourth of them involved heavy weapons, which according to the Minsk agreements were subject to withdrawal from the demarcation line. The militant activity increased along the entire front line, but Avdiivka remained the most intense hotspot. For several days in a row, the militants were attempting to regain control of the strategic road, which, as it was mentioned already, was critical for the rapid redeployment of their troops. The ATO forces repeatedly and successfully fired back, thereby stopping the enemy's aggressive actions. In Mariinka, snipers traditionally remained busy. Militants used 2 C-1 Avdiivka self-propelled howitzers twice near Novotroitsky. In Pavlopil, Ukrainian positions were shelled by mortars 3 times. As a result, over the course of the day, 1 Ukrainian soldier was killed, and 12 others sustained injuries of varying degrees of severity. On the same day, ATO forces shot down 2 Russian unmanned aerial vehicles and discovered Russian electronic warfare systems R-330ZH, Zhitel, and Lear-3 near Makivka. Meanwhile, the Russian propagandists were shooting documentaries about miners and combined harvester drivers who were allegedly fighting for the right to speak in the Russian language. Moreover, while Russian tanks T-72 surprisingly got to star in the film, the numerous pieces of modern Russian equipment filmed according to pseudo-documentary chronicles.